So this is a man we should all know and recognize from the last unit. This is Ulysses S Grant. So he's going to be our 18th president in the United States, and he's going to play a significant role here in Reconstruction. And really, a lot of his role is going to involve the end of Reconstruction. Grant's presidency was not a good one. Unfortunately, while Grant was a good military general and he was great at the end of the Civil War for the Union, he was not exactly the leader that the country needed at the time of Reconstruction. And his presidency is really going to be surrounded by controversy. One of the things Grant's presidency is pretty much known for is corruption, and not because Grant was corrupt, but just because he was surrounded by corrupt people for much of his presidency. It's really going to be marked with scandal. Now, he works well with Congress because he is a Republican. So he has a strong alliance with a lot of the Republicans and radical Republicans who are in Congress. He works well with them, but while he's able to, get things done, it doesn't really matter. A lot of people, around the country are getting distracted by all of this chaos that he's got going on. For example, our vice president at the time, a guy named Schuyler Colfax, he was investigated and implicated for stealing profits from the Union Pacific Railroad Company. I've mentioned before that railroads were a very corrupt industry, and a lot of the scandal that we'll talk about involves railroad companies, and so even the vice president was getting tangled up into it. Grant's own brother-in-law was involved in a scheme with a railway developer to corner the gold market. So his first term, people are really questioning, is he the right guy for us? And he's up for re-election in 1872, and a lot of people don't think that he is the right leader. So a group of Republicans actually break off from the Republican Party, and they form a third party with some Democrats called the Liberal Republican Party, and they are basically reform-minded. They want to reform all of this political corruption and everything. One main thing is they want some civil service reform. If you're wondering what civil service reform is, civil service reform reforms how we decide on government employees, how we hire people who work for the government, how people get jobs that are appointed to them, making sure that those people are not getting the job because, they have the right connections or they know the right people. We're making sure that they're getting the job because they deserve it and because they're going to be good at it. They also wanted to remove troops from the South. They want to end corruption, not just in the North, but in the South as well. They're going to nominate a guy named Horace Greeley for president. And while they get a fair amount of support, Grant still just wipes the floor with them. The Democrats didn't really stand a chance, and thanks to the 15th Amendment, the Republicans had really secured the African-American vote in the South. So it's not going to be, even though Grant, was questioned by several people on whether or not he should serve a second term, he is elected anyway. But unfortunately, the corruption and the scandal just continues. In 1875, we uncover a crime ring we call the Whiskey Ring. It was actually organized by Grant's own personal secretary, a guy named General Orville E. Babcock. They embezzled millions of dollars through forged revenue stamps, and over 200 people ended up being indicted and arrested, most of them from the Department of Treasury. So 200 people from this was just one scandal. The Whiskey Ring was massive, and we've got, that's just one incident. We've got things like this happening all over the federal government at this moment. In 1876, our Secretary of War at the time, William Belknap, ends up being impeached because he was accepting bribes for the sale of trading posts in the Indian Territory. So he's impeached, which means he's charged with a crime, but before he goes to trial, he resigns to sort of try to avoid all the embarrassment. But these are just a couple of examples. Other departments also experience their fair share of corruption. The Freedmen's Bureau, the Navy, the Post Office, the Attorney General's Office, the Interior Department, pretty much every major federal group that we had and in the government at this point had some type of corruption scandal happen during Reconstruction. Congress was not immune to this. In 1873, they passed a new bill to increase their own salaries. We called it the Salary Grab Act. And they even doubled the president's salary to try to make him happy and sort of grease his palms a little bit, but he actually gets so pissed. And because, he's trying to deal with all of this corruption and everything and try to make things easier. But it's just, not being even easier. It's becoming a lot more complicated because Congress is doing all the shady stuff too. So they end up repealing it, but they leave his salary increase because they feel bad. One of the more famous corruption scandals was about this guy right here. His name is William Tweed, also known as Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was a state senator from New York, and he ran a political machine in New York, which is basically a giant, corrupt club of guys from one political party. And he, he was involved in a lot of illegal stuff, buying votes and things like that. But he ended up plundering millions of dollars from the city treasury from New York. He ends up fleeing the country when he gets caught. But a political cartoonist named Thomas Nast, who you see a picture right here that he drew, this picture with a money bag for a head for Boss Tweed. That's the most famous picture of Boss Tweed, actually a lot more famous than any photographs of him. Thomas Nast drew dozens of pictures of Boss Tweed, and they were very, very famous and all over the world, really. And when Boss Tweed fled the country, he went to Paris. And in France, they actually recognized him from a picture that Thomas Nast had drawn, and they ended up arresting him and having him sent back to the United States. So overall, people are feeling very negatively about the government on every level. People are feeling bad about federal government. We've seen state governments and their corruption, and that's leading people to not only not want Reconstruction anymore because they feel like, why should we let the government handle Reconstruction when it's a corrupt group? But people are also thinking, maybe we need to stop worrying about Reconstruction and start worrying about all of this political corruption. We need to make sure our government is working properly. So Reconstruction is not going well. In the fall of 1873, we actually go into a pretty significant economic depression because our largest bank in the United States failed. It failed because it had given out too many loans to railroad companies who didn't pay it back. And so we basically go into a economic depression because of railroad companies, which is sort of wild. And that's not helping things. As time goes on, the support for Reconstruction in the North starts to decline. People are thinking we should turn our attention to the economy. We should turn our attention to this corruption. So in the 1870s, things are going to die down. We're going to start pulling troops out of the South and start to end Southern occupation. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to be dissolved. And even in 1874, Charles Sumner dies. That's really a blow for the radical Republicans and for African Americans. Charles Sumner, you should remember, is a very strong and hardcore abolitionist, and so he was significant in getting the 13th Amendment passed, but he's also advocating for equal rights for African Americans, and he's keeping the radical Republicans focused on that civil rights legislation and getting equality written into the law in the United States. And when he dies, there's no one really around to do that, so a lot of ideas about civil rights are going to take a back burner for a little while. It also doesn't help when the Supreme Court starts doing things to block the progress for equality and block civil rights achievements. While the Reconstruction Acts had been passed, it was still the Supreme Court's job to interpret them. So in the 1870s, we're going to see a lot of those civil rights legislation, as well as the Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, and 15 are going to come up in the Supreme Court, and it's going to be their job to figure out how exactly they're going to play out in real life. There's a series of cases in which the Supreme Court limited racial equality in the United States, and we call those the slaughterhouse cases. And they basically just said, that states had the power to decide what a citizen's rights were if they weren't specifically laid out in the Constitution. So basically everything else that isn't specifically named by the federal government is up to the state to decide whether or not that's your right. So amendments, they said, were made to improve Black rights, not increase rights for all Americans. So this wasn't meant to help, Native Americans or anyone else. It was just meant to make it possible for African Americans to vote. On top of that, they said the amendment, by the amendment, I mean the 14th Amendment, only secured the rights that the national government was responsible for protecting, not all rights. So it sort of limits that idea of, equal protection under the law. The most famous of these cases is the case United States v. Cruickshank, and that revolved around a conspiracy case that stemmed from the Colfax Massacre. It was a massacre of Black soldiers in Colfax, Louisiana. A massive group of Black soldiers were killed after some debate over who the governor of Louisiana was going to be. President Grant sent some soldiers to enforce the Republicans' reign, and a group of white soldiers ended up killing all of the Black soldiers. And so these men were charged with conspiracy, and they were charged by the Reconstruction Amendments, and this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that the Reconstruction Amendments protect citizens from the government. They do not protect citizens from each other. So sort of a cop-out way of allowing these racist white people in the South to get away with slaughtering what ended up being probably between 150 and 200 African Americans, which is just really awful. And that violence is just going to continue as time goes on. As African Americans gain power in the South, there's going to be more white violence, and we're going to see the KKK still around. Not only is there going to be violence, but they're going to be trying to suppress Black power politically as well. There's going to be a coalition of Southern Democrats specifically formed to undermine Republican authority and to make all Southern white people want to vote Democrat instead of Republican. They've pushed to segregate not only schools, but they want to segregate every facility, every public facility in the South, which we know will eventually happen. There was one group of people who were trying to make Reconstruction seem like it worked in order to encourage Congress to end it. They were called the Redeemers. They wanted to redeem the South in the eyes of Congress so that Congress would finally end Reconstruction. But by the mid-1870s, the Republicans in Congress lost control over the House of Representatives, and at that point on, Reconstruction is sort of just going to be a lost cause. It's only going to be a matter of days and just a matter of time until it's officially over, because with the Democrats back in control in the House of Representatives, there's really no one in Congress who is going to be hardcore pushing to continue advocating for African Americans in the South and advocating for Reconstruction.